Welcome back to another episode of The Hunt. My name is George Parkhurst. I'm an executive recruiter with Advice Personnel, which is a full service accounting and recruiting and staffing agency in the New York City area. And I'm taking the mic today to talk about interviewing, and not just interviewing to sell yourself, but also interviewing to find out if that role is going to be the right role for you. Please chime in with any questions. I hope to get to one or two at the end. But I'd love to break this down in three different ways for you, starting out with the job spec, which I believe is a great construct to start, and then understanding your audience better. And then we get into what is typical of later stages in interviewing, which is questions that you have for the interviewer. So win-win questioning. And I'll kick it off with the job spec, which is pretty common. Obviously, a job spec has responsibilities. It includes maybe software or tech that is required for the job, and may give you a little bit of insight as to the organizational structure or the reporting structure of the company, as well as if it's a manager role, potentially who you'd be supervising and how many people you'd be supervising. And I think it's easy enough to say that with the job spec, you should be prepared for anything on the job spec. Things that you've been able to do, that you've prepared for, that are in your prior experience. Be prepared to speak to those. Anything that came up in your background that is things that you've been able to accomplish before that aligns well with the job spec, be ready to speak to that. And I think it's just as important to speak to the things you have done as well as the things you haven't done, which if there are things on that job spec that you may not have done, be prepared to have some sort of experience that potentially aligns with the experience you don't have, or providing a behavioral answer to the interviewer that's going to show that you have the agility and the ability to learn quickly in doing something that you haven't done. And I think the job spec can set yourself up for, is this going to be reiterated during the interview, and will this be reemphasized and give me a sense of, yes, this is important to the role, or maybe new things come up, right? If new things come up, digging into those and understanding, are these critical of the role? So getting started with the job spec is very critical, and then you can kind of work from there. The second piece of this is really understanding and knowing your audience well. And I'll break it down into three ways. I think to start with is that direct supervisor or the hiring manager for the role. You can deduce that, the job specification is going to be very close to what that direct supervisor, potential supervisor, is going to ask you. The work that you're doing is reporting up to them. So if it's on that job spec, it's probably going to be critical to them. But as it is in any interview you have, you need to ensure that you're, listening well and catching anything that might be there that you may not have heard before or may not have seen in a job spec before, and, being able to probe into those certain things. The two other interview situations that are a little bit more nuanced than the HR interview or than the direct supervisor interview, and I got to it, is the HR interview or an interview with a cross-functional partner. And I think this is where it gets kind of fun. With an HR interview, you want to get a feel for it. Let the interview come to you. If the HR interview tends to be a little bit more technical and they're looking for certain buzzwords or certain experience, it's another way for you to deduce how important those technical aspects of the role are to this particular responsibility or to this particular job. Now, if that HR interview moves into more behavioral type questions, get a sense of how important those behavioral, how important those intangible components or those intangibles for the role are. They may ask about your leadership skills. They may ask about, times that you've dealt with, issues around the organization, things that come up and how adaptable you are and how agile you are. So that's going to give you a good sense of, what their role is as a HR interviewing you, and what you really need to convey to them. So I think that's really important, of seeing exactly where that interview goes. Does it move into more of a technical side, or does it end up going into more of a behavioral type interview? And with my third one, which I think is a little bit more nuanced and is important in understanding, is this role right for me, is with cross-functional partners. I work a lot in accounting and finance, And I find that with many of these dynamic interviews that maybe span between 5 and 8 interviews before, a decision is made, you'll have the opportunity to interview with a communications director or a VP of legal, some other, cross-functional leader that is going to get a sense of your background and wants to know where your value is. I think it's important with these cross-functional interviews to understand through how they're speaking to you, how valuable this role is to their organization, and exactly how their department and your department can really partner together. I think especially for somebody who wants to know how they're going to get involved in things outside of maybe what they're seeing on the job spec, it's important to see how a cross-functional partner evaluates the role itself. So that's very critical. And many times you're going to have interviews with people that are not, your potential direct reports or somebody in your department. And I think that's good because you want to get you really want to get a sense of culture fit and exactly how, each department works together, how collaborative it is. We work with a lot of, pre-IPO companies and, fast growth technology companies where, by its very nature, they're very lean. So you are going to have the opportunity to work with them. So in what capacity will you be working with them? So that's going to be very critical. So knowing your audience is so important to knowing what answers you need to provide and how you actually fit into the organization. I think with the answers you get, you're also getting a lot of insight as to, what your value is and how it relates to them. And that really leads into, something that I love preparing my candidates for, which is, the questioning at the end. Now we've gone through job specification and understanding those scopes, and we've gone through kind of knowing your audience, and you're trying to really get as much information as you possibly can to find out if this is for you, as well as, selling yourself the best you can. But the end of the interview tends to be a time for you to come and ask questions. And I feel this is such an important part at closing the loop. There may be potential things you weren't able to bring up that could be of value to the interviewer, or things that you haven't learned just yet that you may want to find out. Asking certain questions can help you really close that loop. And I have 2 particular questions that I find to be very valuable to candidates, and not just valuable in, hey, I learned a lot from this interview, but even starting in a new role and feeling like, wow, this was exactly what I expected. You don't want to go into any role with any kind of concerns or any risks or any uncertainty, because uncertainty is just, scary for anybody. But 2 questions would be, number 1, bottlenecks, challenges, and key initiatives within the organization and as it relates to the person you're interviewing with. So these build on each other, knowing your audience. I think asking the interviewer what are certain bottlenecks that you have that made this role, open, whether it was a newly created role or it was, it happened to be a role that you are replacing somebody for, understanding the bottlenecks is critical, and listening to the answer is so important in finding out, was something reiterated that was on the job spec or repeated again from earlier in the interview? That can give you a great understanding of how certain responsibilities stack up in terms of what is most critical to those people. And especially for you to be able to really fill the gap, right? Maybe there are certain bottlenecks that they have or certain challenges that they're facing that this role can contribute to that you haven't been able to explain. Hey, I actually have done this before. I've been able to work in this capacity before, and I've actually taken this challenge on before, and I'm happy to expand on that more. I think another important question would be how they define a successful candidate after 60 days or after 90 days. And this goes back to knowing your audience again. I think if this can go in 2 directions again, this can go into more of a technical direction, which is again going to validate, this was on the job spec. This is something that is obviously critical to them and their organization. Or maybe another technical thing comes up that wasn't on the job spec and maybe wasn't mentioned earlier in the conversation. That's going to allow you to dig in a little bit and find out, maybe get a little bit more clarity on why this wasn't in the job spec or why this is important to them in the scope of what they're looking to do. It gives you a sense of kind of where the company is, where you fit in, and allows you to close the gap again. You'll hear that a couple times. So these are two really critical questions that I think are going to, number one, make you sound like you're curious and interested in learning more about the role. They want somebody who's really engaged and understands what is going to be expected of them, as well as they want somebody who is trying to figure out if this role is right for them. On the flip side, it's always good to get more information, right? Getting more information is going to allow you to, weigh this opportunity against your current opportunity, weigh it against maybe other potential interviews you have, and give you a lot of clarity on what you're looking for and if this could be the potential right fit. So, asking those questions, thinking about were things repeated, were new things brought up, did it go into maybe more of a behavioral type interview of, hey, what we're looking for here is somebody who's got more of a, got the right attitude and is willing to be hands-on, is willing to be scrappy. If those are certain areas that, that are brought up and maybe technical areas aren't emphasized, you want to make sure that you have the appropriate stories to share with them. It's also going to tell you, do I want to be in a job where they're really looking for somebody who's just got that right attitude and is willing to be hands-on, and this role can grow, but that's not for everybody. Some people are really looking for a role where I want to leverage what I've been able to do to be in a stable environment, doing something that I've actually been successful at before. So you're really going to find out those key things. So, again, I just want to break down kind of the summary of exactly what I've explained. So it starts with the job spec. The job spec is going to talk about all these responsibilities, you getting a good feel as a skeleton of what to expect in the interview. Understanding the audience is going to understand where you are as a value to not just your direct report, not just to HR, but other cross-functional partners that you work with. So I think that's really critical. And then the win-win questioning, asking questions that give you a really good sense of exactly what the role is, give you a little bit more clarity and maybe provide a little bit more nuance for you, and asking those questions to show them how interested you are in being successful in the right role, in understanding that you're not just looking to get a job, you're not just looking to sell yourself, you're looking for them to provide you information to share with you. Hey, this is going to be the right role for you. So I think these things are paramount in interviewing, and really this is just a construct. Obviously interviews can go in many different ways, but having a construct for how you go in and how you approach the interview in the present is critical. And I think it's not just about over preparing prior to an interview. It's more about it's more about being in the present and allowing the interview to take shape so you're able to be successful in that interview. I think people maybe spend a little bit more time, a little too much time memorizing their answers, only feeding off the job spec, which is a good start, but it's not everything. So you need to be able to have a dynamic interview where you're not only learning more about the role, but also, getting, sharing with them, hey, this could be, I could do the things that you're asking me to do. I'm going to go to questions right now because I kind of closed out exactly what I want to share, and I think this is a great time to go to questions and talk a little bit about where certain maybe nuanced things that have happened in your interviews. So, I got a question from Kevin. What's the ideal number of questions to ask without being annoying? I got this question a few weeks ago about a person asked me, I asked about 2 or 3 questions and almost came off as like they were annoyed by the questions that I asked. Well, they have to have an understanding, number one, that you're trying to find out as much about them as you are about them. They're not just interviewing you, you're interviewing them. So I would never say put a number on the questions. I'd say there's always got to be a flow to it. I think if there are certain ways that you can kind of combine questions and certain ways that you can, ask a question to be able to get like multiple answers, I think that's important. But I'd never put a number on the amount of questions you ask, especially if you're curious about knowing the answer to them. Don't ever leave saying, oh, I forgot about this question and it was like, it's critical for me in understanding what I want to do. So ask all questions that are paramount to you finding out what you want to find out. And, try to do it in a way that's respectful, obviously, do it in a way that allows them to be engaged, but never feel like you're annoying them. You're interviewing them just like they're interviewing you. And we're still waiting for a couple other questions to come in, but I'm looking forward to kind of gearing up. But obviously after this, I'll provide my contact information, as well as my LinkedIn, just to be able to have you reach out to me and get a little bit of clarity on maybe how you're going through these processes, or any particular questions that maybe you don't feel comfortable asking right now, that I'd be happy to engage with you, at a later time. So I'm, looking forward to hearing your thoughts on this, on kind of the interview process. And obviously, as I mentioned, this isn't a perfect science, but I think the way you break it down is job spec, knowing your audience, and win-win questioning. And then you can take it from there. So again, it was a pleasure doing this, and I look forward to engaging with any of you on LinkedIn or through email. So this was another episode of The Hunt. My name is George Parkhurst, executive recruiter with Advice Personnel, and I look forward to speaking again on other topics. And I appreciate everyone's engagement.